Mom says you forgot your promise. A 6-year-old girl walked straight through the middle of the Vampire King's own engagement celebration. What he did next ended the party before it began. Mom says you forgot your promise. Welcome back, everyone. If this one pulls you in, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I've got another story just like it waiting for you tomorrow. Now, let's get into it. The ballroom of Castle Nocthollow was built to make mortals feel small and vampires feel eternal. Crystal chandeliers threw white fire across a floor of black marble. Crimson banners hung between windows tall enough to swallow a house. Hundreds of nobles stood in silk and silver, watching their king dance with the woman who would soon be their queen. Kalir Dravenheart moved through the steps of the ceremonial waltz the way he moved through everything, flawlessly and without a single trace of feeling. Valeth smiled up at him like a woman who had already won something. She told herself the rest, the warmth, the wanting, would come later, once the crown made it official. Then the great doors at the far end of the hall groaned open. A girl stood in the gap, small, alone. Her dress was cream-colored linen gone soft and thin from washing. A dusty rose ribbon tied at her waist, her shoes scuffed at the toes. She looked like something that had wandered out of a much poorer story and taken a wrong turn into this one. The guards moved to intercept her and stopped. The ancient wards that had guarded Castle Nocthollow for 3 centuries did not so much as flicker. If anything, the pale flame in the wall sconces leaned toward her as she passed, and something under the marble floor answered her footsteps with a faint, buried glow. How is a human standing in this hall? Someone remove her. She should never have gotten past the gate. The girl heard none of it, or didn't care. She crossed the floor in a straight line, past nobles who drew back from her like she carried a plague, until she stood at the king's feet and reached up and wrapped both small hands around one of his fingers. She looked at him with eyes that had no business being that steady. Mom says you forgot your promise. Kalir did not move. He had led armies. He had signed death warrants without blinking. And now, a child he had never met had said one sentence, and something in his chest. Something he buried under 7 years of ice, cracked clean down the middle. Please come, she said softer now, tugging gently at his hand. Mommy's been waiting for you. 7 years. What is your mother's name? His voice came out lower than he intended. Celine. Celine. Ashwin. The music had not stopped, but Kalir had. Valeth's hand landed on his arm, sharp with warning. The whole kingdom is watching. And for the first time in 100 years, he simply removed her hand and did not look back. Then, let them watch. He knelt, lifted the girl into his arms, and walked out of his own engagement. Across the city, past the vampire towers and their endless light in a room where the roof leaked and the fire had gone out hours ago. A woman lay burning with fever. No physician had been called to treat, and had been telling herself for 7 long years that the man she loved had simply chosen to forget her. She had no idea her daughter had just walked into a castle to prove her wrong. Chapter 2. The Promise Beneath the Snow. The royal carriage was already waiting at the base of the castle steps, its black lacquer gleaming under torchlight, 4 shadow mares stamping at the cobblestones. Kalir set Neria down and reached for the door. She shook her head. It won't fit. It's a carriage, Kalir said. It fits where I tell it to, not where we live. She said it plainly, the way children say true things without meaning to wound. The streets get too skinny. You have to walk the last part. He looked at her a moment longer, then waved the carriage away. Behind him, he heard Valeth's voice rise somewhere near the doors, sharp and cut off, and he did not turn around to hear the rest of it. Neria took his finger again, the same small, sure grip, and led him down through the lower gates. The guards followed at a distance, cloaked and silent, close enough to strike and far enough to be forgotten. Kalir barely noticed them. He had walked every part of Nocthollow at some point in 138 years, but never this part. Not really. Not with his eyes open. The human district began the way a wound begins, a hairline crack in the polished stone, then wider, then rot. Cobbles gave way to packed mud. The soaring towers of the vampire quarter kept glowing behind them, indifferent and far away, throwing violet light down onto streets where families crouched around fires too small to warm anyone. A woman pulled her children back into a doorway as Kaylor passed. He didn't blame her. Nerea walked like she belonged to none of it and all of it at once. "Do kings get lost easy?" she asked, apropos of nothing, swinging his hand a little as they walked. "No." Kaylor said. "Why?" "Because Mommy said you promised to come back." "But you never found us." He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be a lie. And he found, walking beside this child in the mud and the cold, that he did not have it in him to lie to her. 7 years peeled backward. He remembered Celine as she had been, a maid in his father's household, quick-handed and quicker-tongued, the only person in the castle who had ever told him he was being unreasonable and meant it. She brought him tea on the nights he couldn't sleep, though vampires didn't need sleep and she knew it, and sat with him anyway. She stitched his gloves after the border skirmishes tore them. She treated human servants the physicians wouldn't touch, cleaning wounds with her own hands while nobles looked away in disgust. He had not meant to love her. It had simply happened, the way frost happens, one still night at a time, until he woke and the whole world was covered in it. They had kept it hidden. Vampire law was clear. A royal did not take a human companion, not openly, not ever, and so their entire history together had lived in stolen hours and closed doors. Before he left for the war that would make him king, he had pressed a silver moon pendant into her palm and told her to wait for him. "When I come back," he'd said, "I'll tear down every law that says I can't have you." He had meant it with everything he was. He came back wounded, victorious and orphaned. His father dead, 3 rival clans circling the throne like carrion birds, the council pressing a crown onto his head before his father's body was cold. When he'd finally asked for Celine, they told him she was gone. They'd shown him letters, her handwriting, or close enough to fool a grieving son, describing Coin, a human man, a life she'd chosen over him. He had believed it. He had been too broken, too newly crowned, too surrounded by wolves to question it. He had let his heart go cold instead, because cold was easier to rule with than grief. He had never once looked for her. "Mommy used to tell me about a lonely prince," Nerea said now, breaking into the memory as if she'd been standing inside it with him. She said he pretended not to care about anything, but she said he was kinder than he knew. Kaylor's throat tightened around words he didn't have. Did she ever say his name? Nerea nodded. Only when she thought I was asleep. They stopped in front of a cottage leaning against the old city wall, its roof patched with tar cloth, one window stuffed with rags instead of glass. Kaylor took in the details the way he'd once taken in battlefields, automatically, completely, and each one a small wound. A child's winter cloak too thin for the season hung by the door. A bowl of medicine sat untouched beside an empty plate. A pair of small shoes, resoled so many times the stitching had run out of room, sat by the hearth. From the back room came the sound of breathing, wet, uneven, and too slow. "Mommy," Nerea called, pulling him through the door. "I brought him." Kaylor stepped into the room and stopped breathing entirely. Celine lay on a narrow wooden bed, thinner than he remembered, her brown hair damp and dark against a fever-flushed face. 7 years had aged her the way suffering ages people, not gently. And still he knew her instantly, the way he would have known her in any room in any century, blind. Her eyes opened, found his. Neither of them spoke. 7 years of longing and fury and grief passed between them in the silence, unanswered questions stacked on unanswered questions, until Celine's cracked lips finally moved. "You came." Kaylor crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, taking her burning hand in both of his. "I should have come years ago." Behind him, Neria climbed up onto the edge of the bed to press her face against her mother's shoulder. And as she leaned forward, something slipped loose from the collar of her dress and swung free on a thin silver chain. Kaylor went still. It was a moon-shaped pendant, tarnished with age, but unmistakable. The one he had placed around Celine's neck himself 7 years ago, the night he promised to come back. There was only one person who could have put it around his daughter's neck. Chapter 3. The blood that could not lie. Why does she wear it? Kaylor's voice came out rougher than he intended, his eyes still fixed on the small silver moon against his daughter's collarbone. Celine's hand found Neria's shoulder, steadying herself as much as the child. She started asking about her father when she was 4, where he was, why she didn't have one, like the other children. Her breath caught, fever and memory tangled together. I couldn't give her a name. I could give her that. It was the only proof I had that he'd ever existed at all. He, not Kaylor. Not even now. Kaylor rose and crossed to the doorway, calling for his guard captain in a voice that cracked stone. Bring the royal physician, now. Celine's reaction was immediate and violent. She tried to push herself upright, one hand reaching toward Neria like she could shield her by will alone. No, please. Don't call the palace. They'll take her. They'll say I'm unfit. No one is taking her. Kaylor knelt back down, catching her hand before she could do more damage to herself. I swear it. Celine's laugh was thin and bitter, more cough than sound. Do your promises still mean anything, Kaylor? The question landed exactly where she meant it to. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like the same broken vow dressed up in new clothes. It was Neria who broke the silence. With a cough of her own, small and rattling, the cottage's damp and smoke finally catching in her chest, Kaylor turned to her without thinking, the way he'd have turned to any soldier under his command, and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead to check for fever. The moment his skin touched hers, the room changed. Heat surged up his wrist like a struck match. Crimson gold light bled up through his skin in looping ancient symbols he hadn't seen since his coronation. The old script of House Dravenheart, the mark that only answered to blood of blood. The same light bloomed across the back of Neria's small hand, and for one heartbeat, directly over her chest, the royal crest itself flared bright enough to throw shadows against the walls before fading. Every candle in the room guttered and burned red. The cottage groaned like something old, waking up. Kaylor didn't move. Couldn't. He had commanded armies without his pulse changing, and now he knelt frozen on a dirt floor because his own blood had just told him something his mind wasn't ready to hear. Royal blood magic did not lie. It did not mistake. It answered to nothing but lineage. Neria was his. Celine turned her face to the wall, unable to watch whatever was about to cross his features. Why, he said. And it wasn't really a question, more a wound given a shape. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know until after you'd already left for the war. Her voice was hollow, worn smooth by 7 years of carrying this alone. Before I could get word to you, the council already knew. Someone talked. Someone always talks. Her hands twisted the edge of the blanket. They locked me away, questioned me for days. Some of them wanted me executed for daring to carry, for contaminating the bloodline, they called it. Kaylor's jaw tightened until they didn't kill me. They exiled me instead on one condition, that I never speak your name as her father. If I tried to reach you, they told me they'd kill the child before she ever drew breath. She finally looked at him again, eyes glassy with fever and old grief. By the time I heard you'd taken the crown, you were surrounded by enemies on every side. I thought reaching for you would only paint a target on her back. They told me you left me for another man, Kaylor said quietly. That you took coin and walked away. Celine stared at him, and for a moment the fever seemed to recede behind pure disbelief. They told you what? Neither of them finished the thought. They didn't need to. Both of them had spent 7 years grieving a betrayal that had never actually happened, engineered, brick by the same hands on both sides of the lie. Neria, who had followed only pieces of the conversation, looked between them with the plain, uncomplicated logic of a 6-year-old. "Does this mean you're my papa?" Kaelor, feared by nobles, generals, entire rival courts, found that he could not answer for a full 3 seconds. Then he knelt fully before her so they were eye to eye. Yes, Neria studied his face like she was checking the answer against something she already believed, then threw both arms around his neck. Kaelor's hands hovered a moment before closing carefully around her small back, and something in his chest that had been locked for 7 years came apart at the seams. He didn't get to hold it long. Selene convulsed. Dark veins spread beneath her skin like ink through water, climbing her throat, and she doubled over, coughing blood onto the blanket. Kaelor was at her side instantly, shouting for the physician again. And this time the man arrived within minutes, kneeling at the bed with instruments already in hand. It didn't take him long to find the truth. "This is not fever, my lord." The physician's face had gone grim. "This is nightshade ash, a vampire assassin's poison, slow-acting, meant to look like natural illness. Judging by how far it spread, she's been dying for months. Someone had been trying to kill her, quietly, patiently, and no one had noticed until a 6-year-old girl walked into a palace to ask for help." Kaelor sealed the cottage within the hour. Selene and Neria were carried out under armed guard, wrapped against the cold, bound for the one place Kaelor now trusted more than anywhere else in Nocthollow, his own walls. From a rooftop across the narrow street, unseen and unmoving, Valeth watched it all. She watched the guards lift Selene into a covered litter. She watched Kaelor carry Neria himself, refusing to hand her to anyone else. And in the torchlight, just for a moment, she saw it. The royal mark still glowing faintly across the back of the child's small hand. She did not wait to see more. By the time the guards reached the castle gates, Valeth was already descending into a chamber hidden beneath the west wing, where the oldest voices in Nocthollow had been waiting for her. One of them rose as she entered. The child should never have survived. Chapter 4. The Woman the Council Erased. By dawn, Selene lay in a bed within Kaelor's private wing, sheets finer than anything she touched in 7 years, a fire burning steady and warm in the hearth, and guards posted outside a door that had never once, in the history of Castle Nocthollow, held a human on the other side of it. The palace did not know what to do with itself. Below stairs, among the human servants, the news moved in careful whispers and quiet, disbelieving joy. "She's alive! She's here! The king brought her home himself." Above stairs, among the nobles, the word used was not rescue. It was insult. A human woman, dying and poor, given a bed in the king's own wing, while his betrothed's wedding gown still hung unfinished in a tailor shop 3 floors below. Neria was bathed, dressed in soft new clothes, and shown to a bedroom large enough to swallow her entire cottage twice over. She looked at the canopy bed, the tall windows, the fire already crackling in the grate, and shook her head with the same flat certainty she'd used on the carriage the night before. "I want to sleep by mommy." No amount of coaxing from the nursemaids moved her. In the end, Kaelor settled it himself, ordering a smaller bed carried in and set beside Selene's, close enough that Neria could reach out and touch her mother's hand in the dark. No one questioned the order twice. Kaelor did not sleep. He went to the archives instead. He expected to find something, records of Selene's service, her wages, the chamber she'd once occupied down the servants' corridor. He found nothing. Not a single ledger entry bore her name. Her employment history had been removed as cleanly as if she had never crossed the threshold of the palace at all. Her medical records, her chamber assignments, gone. Every trace of them. Scraped out of 7 years of royal bookkeeping with a precision that told him this hadn't been carelessness. It had been effort. He spent the following hours questioning every servant still on staff who might remember her. Most gave careful, frightened non-answers. 2 names came up as women who might know more. Both had vanished from palace service within weeks of Celine's disappearance, and no one could say where they'd gone. It was an elderly laundress, stooped and gray-haired, who finally broke. She would not meet his eyes as she spoke. "I saw them take her, my lord. Council guards." She was carrying. She was already carrying the child, and she begged them, and they dragged her through the servants' passage like she was nothing. Her voice shook. "I never told anyone. I was afraid of what would happen to me." Kaylor said nothing for a long moment. Then the windows along the archive wall cracked, hairline fractures spidering silently across old glass, and the laundress flinched back against the shelves. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The rage in him had found a quieter, colder shape than shouting. While Kaylor tore through 7 years of buried paperwork, Vaelith knelt in a chamber beneath the west wing, facing 3 of the oldest nobles in Noctalo. "You understand what that child represents," the council leader said, his voice a dry rustle of old parchment. "If Kaylor acknowledges her, the wards recognized her as royal blood before a court full of witnesses, half-human heirs, legitimized bloodlines. Humans with a voice in matters that have belonged to us since before your grandmother's grandmother drew breath. Centuries of law," another added. "Centuries of order, undone by a laundress's daughter." "I love him," Vaelith said, and hated how small it sounded in that stone room. The leader's smile held no warmth at all. "Love is a lovely thing to have once you're queen. It is useless without a crown to keep it in." They laid the plan before her plainly, the way one might lay out a ledger. The poison already working through Celine's blood would finish its work soon enough. A mercy, they called it, sparing everyone the mess of a trial. The child would disappear in the confusion that followed, and Vaelith would remain exactly where she belonged, at Kaylor's side, his only path back to stability, his grief eventually softening into gratitude. She thought, unbidden, of the version of Kaylor who had once pulled out her chair without being asked, who had spoken to her, before all this, like she mattered as more than a crown waiting to be filled. The memory lasted only a moment. Jealousy buried it faster than conscience could dig it back up. "Fine," she said quietly. Celine woke near midday to find Kaylor seated at her bedside, watching her the way a man watches something he still isn't sure is real. "You hated me," she said before he could speak. "It wasn't a question. For 7 years," he admitted. "Every day of them. I defended you to her." Celine's eyes drifted to Neria, asleep in the smaller bed beside her own. "Even the nights I believed, in my worst moments, that you truly had forgotten us. I couldn't let her grow up believing she was unwanted. Not when it wasn't true." Kaylor's throat worked before he could answer. "Why send her to me now after all this time?" "I didn't." Celine shook her head slowly. "I was feverish. I must have said your name, said something about the promise, without even knowing I was saying it out loud. She heard enough." Her voice cracked. "She left while I was too sick to stop her. She walked across the city alone because I was too afraid, for 7 years, to walk to your door myself." Kaylor looked at his daughter, small and sleeping, and understood the truth of it fully for the first time, that neither of her parents had been brave enough to close the distance the council had built between them. It had taken a 6-year-old to do what they couldn't. "If you name her publicly," Celine warned, "the nobles won't accept it quietly. You could be starting a war inside your own court. Then the kingdom will learn," Kaylor said, "that my daughter is not the danger here. Their hatred is." Before Celine could answer, the door opened without ceremony. The royal physician entered, his face pale in a way that made Kaylor rise instantly. "My lord." The man's voice was tight, the poison in her blood. "It's changed. It's reacting to the healing magic we've been giving her." He hesitated, as if the next words cost him something to say. "Someone inside this castle has altered her medicine." Chapter 5. The price of an immortal heart. Kaylor sealed the royal wing within the hour. No one entered or left without his personal guard standing witness. Every physician who had touched Celine's medicine was questioned. Every servant who had crossed the threshold of her room was accounted for one by one, until the truth surfaced the way truth always did once someone finally started looking for it. A vial of antidote, quietly swapped for something else entirely, something designed to speed the very poison it claimed to cure. The servant responsible was found in his quarters before Kaylor could question him. Dead. Throat opened cleanly, no struggle, no witnesses. Someone had made certain he would never confess a name. Celine's condition did not wait for the investigation to finish. By nightfall, her breathing had gone shallow and uneven, her pulse fluttering under the physician's fingers like something already trying to leave. Medicine that should have slowed the poison did nothing at all now. Her heart, the physician said grimly, was failing, not in days, but in hours. There is one possibility, my lord. The physician would not meet Kaylor's eyes as he said it. The crimson life bond. Kaylor went very still. He knew the ritual only as a forbidden word passed down in old texts, a rite through which a vampire poured a portion of his own immortal life directly into a dying mortal, binding the two together at the root. It was outlawed for good reason. It weakened the vampire permanently, stripped away centuries of accumulated strength in a single act, and if the mortal's body failed during the transfer, there was no guarantee the vampires would survive it either. Prepare it, Kaylor said. The council came to him within the hour, exactly as he'd expected. They stood in his private study with the particular calm of men who believed they were the reasonable ones in the room, and told him one after another that Noctalo could not afford to risk its king over a human woman already half lost to poison. Valith came last and did it best. She wrung her hands, let her voice tremble in all the right places, told him the kingdom needed him whole, needed him crowned and steady, not gambling his immortality on a servant girl from 7 years past. He almost believed her. He might have believed her if he hadn't caught the flicker of something calculating behind her eyes the moment before she looked away. 7 years ago, Kaylor said, I chose the kingdom because I believed she had chosen to leave it. I was wrong then. I will not abandon her again. He walked past all of them and did not look back. They laid Celine inside a circle of crimson runes carved fresh into the stone floor of the old ritual chamber, her body pale and still against the dark marble. Kaylor knelt beside her, drew a blade across his own palm, and pressed the wound directly over her heart. The runes ignited. What followed was not sensation so much as invasion, his life pouring into her through the open wound, and hers pouring back into him in fragments too vivid to be anything but memory. He saw her dragged from the palace gates, pregnant and pleading, guards on either arm. He saw her alone in a cramped healer's ward, no one beside her, gripping a stranger's hand through hours of labor because there was no one else to grip. He saw Neria, small and confused, asking why the other children in the district had fathers and she didn't. And he saw Celine's face crumple somewhere she thought her daughter couldn't see. He saw her standing outside the castle gates on the anniversary of his promise, year after year, in the cold, waiting for a man who never came, because some stubborn, unkillable part of her still believed he might. Grief tore through him with a force he had no defenses against. His hands shook against her chest, and Celine, barely conscious, was seeing him in return. His return from the war, wounded and searching, tearing through the palace demanding answers. The forged letter placed in his hands, her signature copied close enough to break him. The 7 years he'd spent believing she'd simply walked away, when she had spent those same 7 years believing the exact same lie about him. Neither of them had abandoned the other. They had both been erased, deliberately, by the same hands, and told 2 different stories built from the same lie. The ritual began pulling faster than the physician had warned it might. Kaylor felt his own strength thinning, his vision narrowing at the edges, the ancient weight of centuries draining out of him faster than his will could hold it back. The chamber doors burst open. Neria tore past the guards trying to catch her, small and fierce, and threw herself between her parents. She took Celine's hand in one of hers and reached for Kaelor's with the other, gripping both as tightly as her small hands allowed. "Promises aren't broken," she said. "If you finally come home." The runes flared gold, then steadied. Celine's heartbeat found its rhythm again beneath Kaelor's palm, slow and even and alive. Kaelor collapsed. He didn't wake for hours. When he finally surfaced, it was to the sound of a small voice narrating an entire future at his bedside. Bread, warm and fresh, the kind Mommy liked. Walks through the palace gardens once she was strong enough. A supper, all three of them at the same table. No council, no crown, just family. "You have to wake up first, though," Neria informed him solemnly, as if this were a reasonable condition. "Papa." Kaelor opened his eyes. Whatever strength the ritual had taken from him, that single word gave something back. He was still weak, still hollowed out from the bond, when a royal messenger arrived at the chamber door, breathless and pale, a sealed scroll trembling in his hand. "My lord." The messenger would not meet his eyes. "The council has called an emergency judgment. At sunrise." He hesitated as if the words themselves might be treason. "At sunrise, Lady Celine and the child are to stand trial for crimes against the vampire throne." Chapter 6. The Trial of the Human Hair. The great throne hall had not held this many nobles since Kaelor's coronation. Celine walked in on her own feet, though it cost her, still pale, still weak from the ritual. One hand braced lightly against a servant's arm until she reached the center of the floor. There she straightened and refused any further help. Neria walked between her parents, a small hand in each of theirs. Chin lifted like she'd decided fear was something that happened to other people. Vaelith arrived last, in ceremonial crimson and gold, every inch, the woman who still believed she was owed a crown. "This woman," she announced, pointing at Celine before the assembled court, "seduced the king in secret, hid his child from the throne for 6 years, and has now used forbidden blood magic to manipulate him into risking his own immortality." A murmur rolled through the hall. The council leader stepped forward, next presenting testimony, sworn statements he called them from servants claiming Celine had spoken openly for years about placing her daughter on the throne, about using the child to win rights and power for the human districts. Kaelor recognized 2 of the names attached to the statements. Both belonged to servants who had vanished from the palace years ago and never been seen since. "These are forgeries," Kaelor said, "built by the same hands that forged the letter convincing me Celine had left me. I have the laundress's testimony. I have the empty archive where 7 years of her service should exist. I have proof enough to try every one of you for treason before I try her for anything." The council leader did not flinch. "Proof or not, my lord, the law is older than any of us. No child born of a human mother may inherit vampire sovereignty. That law does not bend for grief or love or a mother's intentions." He laid out their demands plainly, as if reading a ledger. Celine would be exiled or executed. Neria would be stripped of the Dravenheart name. And Kaelor, for the sake of stability, for the sake of a kingdom that could not survive the appearance of weakness, would honor his engagement to Vaelith. Kaelor looked at Vaelith for a long moment. "I release you from our engagement," he said, loud enough to carry to the farthest banner in the hall. "Effective now." Before this entire court, the silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and disbelieving. Vaelith's composure cracked open in front of hundreds of witnesses, humiliation flooding her face before she could smooth it back into something regal. "You've grown weak," she said, low and furious. "The king I nearly married would never have thrown away a kingdom's stability for a servant's bastard. Cruelty wearing tradition's clothes," Kaelor said, "is not strength. It never was." He turned from her to the court entire. "I formally declare Neria Ashwin my daughter, born of my blood, confirmed by magic older than any council seat in this hall. The hall erupted. Nobles shouted over one another. Outrage, disbelief, a scattering of voices too quiet to be heard clearly but not quiet enough to be nothing. And in the middle of the chaos, the marble beneath Nerea's feet began to glow. Not the pale light of the wards this time, something deeper, older, crimson gold and pulsing like a heartbeat under stone. Behind the throne, a section of the wall groaned and split apart, revealing a passage that had not seen use or light in longer than anyone in the hall had been alive. Cold air rose from the stairwell beneath it, and the glow beneath Nerea's feet pulled toward it like a current she couldn't resist. She walked toward it before anyone could stop her. Kalar went after her immediately. Selene followed despite her weakness, and behind them, unable to stay away from whatever was unfolding, came Valeth and the full council, drawn down the ancient stairs into a chamber none of them had ever seen. At its center sat a throne carved from black stone veined with dull crimson. Dust settled over it thick enough to prove it hadn't been touched in centuries. The blood throne, spoken of only in old texts, built by Noctalo's first rulers and abandoned so long ago most believed it was myth. Nerea approached it without hesitation, small against its towering shape, and pressed her palm flat to the stone. The chamber woke. Light poured up through carved channels in the floor. Shapes gathered at the edges of the room. Not quite solid, not quite shadow, ancient and watching. Across the walls, script long buried under dust began to glow, letter by letter, until the full inscription stood revealed. The throne shall not belong to the purest blood, but to the heart that unites the divided night. The magic surged around Nerea, gentle and certain, recognizing her not as an anomaly to be erased, but as exactly what the throne had been built to find. The council stood frozen. For generations, they had enforced a law of pure blood as sacred, unbending, ancient beyond question. And here in the oldest chamber of their own castle, that law was being proven a lie of their own making, or at best a truth twisted to serve them. Valeth stood apart from all of it, staring at the light gathered around the small girl who had, in a single week, dismantled every plan built to secure her a crown. As long as that child lived, Valeth understood there would never be a throne for her to claim. That night, in a chamber lit only by dying embers, Valeth stood over Nerea's sleeping form with a silver dagger held loosely in one hand. Nerea's eyes opened, slow and unafraid, blinking up at her with the same sleepy trust she gave everyone. "Are you here because you're lonely too?" Valeth's hand, steady through every plot and every betrayal that had brought her to this room, began to tremble. Chapter 7. The bride who chose the crown. The dagger did not fall. Valeth stood over the sleeping child a moment longer, hands shaking, every plan the council had built for her suddenly heavier in her grip than the blade itself. "Beautiful people shouldn't look so sad," Nerea said, still half caught in sleep, studying Valeth's face without a trace of fear. "You can have my ribbon if you want. It's pink. I think it would look nice with your dress." The offer was so small, so entirely without calculation, that it cracked something in Valeth she'd thought had closed over years ago. She lowered the dagger, stepped back from the bed, and left the room without a word. And without striking, she told herself, walking the corridor back to her own chambers, that it meant nothing, that she'd simply chosen a better moment. The council did not see it that way. They summoned her before the sun rose, and this time there was no gentleness in how they spoke to her. Her family's lands, her family's rank, the wealth that had kept her house seated among the oldest names in Noctalo, all of it, they reminded her, existed only as long as the old laws held. Kalar's reforms would unmake generations of standing in a single stroke, and hers would unmake with it. "You hesitated," the council leader said, "because you still believe you have time to be remembered kindly. You don't. The moment his reforms pass, women like you become irrelevant. Ornaments, nothing more. By the time she left the chamber, Vaelith had convinced herself that the mercy in that bedroom had been weakness, and weakness was a luxury she could no longer afford. The council began preparing its final move. In the royal wing, something quieter and steadier was taking root. Selene grew stronger by the day, though not quickly enough for Kaelor's liking. One evening, sitting beside her window with the last of the sunlight gold across the floor, she finally said the thing she'd been circling for days. "I still love you." Her voice was careful, like she was setting down something fragile. "But if I let myself fall back into this too quickly, I'm afraid it erases everything the last 7 years cost me." Cost her. Her eyes went to the door, where Neria's laughter carried faintly from the hall. "Then I won't ask you to rush," Kaelor said. "I'll spend however long it takes. A year, 10. I have time I never deserved a second chance at." He meant it, and he proved it in small ways rather than grand ones. He began taking breakfast with Neria instead of council reports. He listened, uninterrupted, to stories that had no point except that she wanted to tell them. He let her carry flowers into his war room and arrange them, without complaint, among maps built for war rather than blooms. "Why does everyone act scared of you?" Neria asked him once, arranging a crooked handful of lilies in a cup meant for ink. "Because fear was easier to rule with than love," he said. "It required less of me." She considered that with the seriousness only a 6-year-old could summon. "Maybe they should know you better." He began, quietly and then not so quietly, drafting reforms, legal protection for humans, fair wages, medical care no longer denied on the basis of blood, the right to testify against a noble in open court. Word of the drafts spread through the aristocracy before he'd even finished them, and the resistance came fast and open. Old houses that had smiled through the trial now spoke openly of rebellion. It was one of Kaelor's own loyal guards who found the proof that turned resistance into something more dangerous. Records showing council members had purchased nightshade ash themselves, paid coin to assassins operating in the human district. The same poison that had nearly killed Selene traced directly back to the men who'd stood in judgment of her. The guard didn't make it far with what he'd found. He was attacked before he could bring it to Kaelor directly, and staggered instead to Selene's door, bleeding, pressing a blood-stained ledger into her hands before his strength gave out. She had barely finished reading the names inside when the horns sounded. The gathering had been called to formally announce Neria's status before the wider court, a public ceremony deliberately open, deliberately safe. It was Vaelith who found Kaelor first, breathless, insisting the border clans had struck the eastern wall and needed him immediately. He left with a small guard at his back, believing her. The moment he was gone, armed nobles moved through the royal wing like they'd been waiting for exactly this window. Because they had. Selene didn't waste time on disbelief. She pulled Neria through a servant's passage she remembered from her years scrubbing floors in this same castle, a route so narrow and forgotten that most of the current guard had never even mapped it. She pushed Neria ahead of her into the dark. "Keep going, don't stop, don't look back." But the passage ended in armed men on the other side, and Selene was seized before she'd taken 3 more steps. Neria could have kept running. The passage behind her was still open, still dark, still hers to disappear into. She turned back instead. "Mommy." A gloved hand closed around her before she reached the corridor's mouth. Vaelith lifted her without gentleness, without cruelty either, simply without room left for either, and began carrying her toward the stairs that led down to the blood throne chamber. Behind them in the servants' passage, the council closed in around Selene, already speaking in low, practiced voices about how her death would be explained come morning. A human uprising, they would call it. Tragic, unavoidable. No one would think to ask why the timing was so convenient. Chapter 8. When the castle awakened, the eastern wall was silent when Kaelor reached it. No border clans, no breach, nothing but empty ramparts and the wind moving through banners that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. He understood in the space of one cold heartbeat exactly what he'd been lured away from. Then it hit him. Not a sound, not a message, but something older, carried through the blood bond forged the night the runes had first ignited between his hand and Neria's. Fear, small and sharp and hers. He didn't remember the ride back to the castle. He only remembered arriving. Deep beneath, knocked hollow, the blood-throne chamber blazed with torchlight. The council had brought themselves. Enough to see by, not enough to be seen from above. Neria stood at the center of the old runes, small and still, Valith's hand closed around her shoulder. Her blood will seal the throne, the council leader said, circling slowly. Bind it back into dormancy. Erase her claim from the magic itself, the way it should have been erased 7 years ago. He looked at Valith. You'll do it. It should be someone who's already proven her loyalty. Valith's hand tightened on the dagger. Neria didn't cry, didn't plead for herself at all. Please don't hurt my mom, she said instead, looking past the blade entirely, straight at the council leader. She didn't do anything. She just loved him. That's not a crime. The chamber answered before anyone else could. Crimson light tore up through the rooms on the floor, climbing the walls in branching veins of fire. The heavy doors above sealed themselves shut with a sound like a held breath, finally released. Somewhere throughout the castle, stone guardians that had stood motionless for centuries turned their carved heads. Shapes gathered at the chamber's edges, not shadow this time, not vague, solid enough to be seen, ancient enough to make even the council fall silent. The first rulers of Noctalo, called forth by the very magic the council had come to abuse. Those who betray innocent blood, the voices said, layered together like wind through old stone, have forfeited this castle's protection. The council's magic guttered. Spells half-formed died in their hands. Valith raised the dagger toward Neria and hesitated, exactly as she had the night before, her arm shaking under the weight of a choice she still hadn't fully made. The council leader didn't wait for her to decide. He lunged for the girl himself, magic gathering black and cold around his outstretched hand. Valith moved without thinking, not for Neria's sake alone. For her own, for every year she'd spent being told what to do and by whom, for the disposable role she'd finally recognized herself playing. She threw herself between them and took the strike meant for the child, a line of dark fire opening across her arm. That was when Kaelor arrived. The chamber doors he'd sealed behind him tore open regardless, the castle itself choosing which laws still applied. He crossed the room in strides too fast to track, and the fight broke open around him. Guards loyal to the throne clashing with council enforcers. The air thick with spellfire and steel. He was still weak from the crimson life bond, his strength a fraction of what it had been, and he felt every missing piece of it now. He couldn't win this alone. He didn't have to. Loyal guards held the line at his back. The castle's guardian stone shifted and struck where his own reach fell short. And Neria, small, blazing faintly gold where the throne's magic still clung to her skin, stood unshaken in the center of it all. Untouchable in a way none of them could explain and none of them questioned. Celine reached the throne hall above just as the last of the council's allies scattered. She had slipped her captors in the old servant passage, the same one she'd used to hide Neria hours before, and now she stood before what remained of the gathered court with a blood-stained ledger in trembling hands. Bribes, she said, voice raw but carrying. Poison purchases. Forged letters. The names of every servant who vanished after they realized what had truly happened 7 years ago. And the order, signed, sealed, authorizing my exile while I was carrying a child none of them wanted to exist. The court that had once called for her execution now stood in silence, reading truth off pages no one could argue away. Below, Kaelor finally drove the council leader to the ground, his blade at the man's throat. He didn't take the killing blow. Instead, he dragged him, still bleeding, up into the throne hall itself, before every witness who remained. "Confess," Kaler said, "before them, not before me." The blood throne's magic still lingered thick in the air, and it did not permit half-truths. The council leader's mouth opened as if against his own will. "We separated them," he said, "because their child threatened everything. A bloodline that could unite humans and vampires would end centuries of noble control. We built the lie because the truth was unbearable to us, not to you." His eyes flicked to Valeth, standing wounded near the throne's base. She knew about the poison from the beginning. Valeth didn't deny it. "I knew," she said, quiet enough that the whole silent hall still heard it. "But when it came to it, I stopped him from killing her." She nodded toward Neria. "That has to count for something." Kaelor looked at her for a long moment. The woman he'd once nearly married, who had known about a murder plot and stayed silent until the very last second it mattered. "It counts for the difference between an execution and a cell," he said. "I won't build whatever comes next out of revenge, but you will answer for what you allowed." He turned to his guards. "Take her. She stands judgment, not the blade." The council leader, still on his knees, made one final desperate lunge. Not for Kaelor, but toward Selene, standing closest to him, the ledger still clutched against her chest. Neria moved first. She stepped directly between them, small and unflinching, and the throne's magic answered instantly. A wave of ancient light pouring up through the chamber floor and out through every rune in the castle's bones. It struck the council leader mid-motion, tore the stolen power from his hands, and closed around him like the stone itself had decided to finish what centuries of dormancy had only delayed. When the light faded, he was gone. In his place stood a column of pale stone, twisted mid-reach, silent forever. The chamber went still. No more spellfire, no more shouting. Only the low, steady hum of runes finally settling back into rest. Then the Blood Throne spoke. Not through any single voice, but through the castle entire. Walls and floor and torchlight all carrying the same words at once. "The heir has been accepted. Now the king must choose what kind of kingdom she will inherit." Chapter 9. The promise kept. Weeks passed before the castle stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling like a home again. Selene recovered slowly, strength returning to her by inches rather than leaps. The crimson life bond had left its mark on both of them permanently, her life now woven into his in a way no ritual could undo, and Kaelor's immortality measurably thinner than it had been the night he knelt beside her dying bed. He never once spoke of it as a loss. Whenever the physician raised it, cautious and apologetic, Kaelor only said the same thing. A gift costs something, or it isn't a gift. The surviving conspirators faced judgment in the same throne hall where the truth had first been dragged into the light. Some were imprisoned within the castle's oldest cells. Others lost titles and lands their families had held for centuries, watching seats of power hollow out in a single afternoon. The families of servants who had vanished during Selene's exile were found where they could be found and compensated for years no coin could truly repay. Their names, erased once from the royal archives, were restored, ledger by ledger, until the record finally matched the truth. Valeth was brought before Kaelor alone, without an audience this time. She did not defend herself the way she once might have. "I told myself it was destiny," she said, "that the crown was owed to me, but it was never destiny. It was entitlement wearing a nicer word." Her voice caught. "I thought if I became queen, you'd eventually love me the way you loved her. I know now that isn't how it works. Love taken by force becomes possession," Kaelor said, not unkindly. "It stops being love the moment you have to make someone hold still for it." He could have ended her claim to everything in that room. Instead, he reminded her, and himself, of the one true thing she'd done when it mattered. The strike she'd taken meant for a child who wasn't hers to protect. "You're exiled," he said, far from Nocthalo under guard for the rest of your years, not the blade. Not because you've earned mercy outright, but because I refuse to build whatever comes next on top of more bodies. She left the castle within the week and did not look back. The reforms came next, and they came fast. No human could be expelled from the kingdom without formal trial. Mixed-blood children, a category that had, until recently, barely existed in law at all, received explicit legal protection. Human workers were guaranteed fair wages and the medical care once denied outright. The council's hereditary grip on power was dissolved entirely, replaced by a throne that answered, as the old inscription had promised, to character and lawful descent rather than purity of blood. The old houses resisted, loudly at first, then quietly, as they realized the castle itself had already chosen a side. Wards that had once been indifferent to human presence now seemed almost welcoming. Stone guardians that had woken once to defend a 6-year-old girl did not go fully back to sleep. Neria was formally introduced to the court as Princess Neria Dravenheart Ashwin, though she'd insisted, with the same flat certainty she brought to every important decision, on keeping her mother's name stitched into her own. I'm not just his, she'd told Kaylor plainly. I'm hers too. He hadn't argued. He'd been proud of her for saying it. For the ceremony she wore a cream-colored dress with a dusty rose ribbon at the waist, the same colors deliberately chosen as the dress she'd worn the night she first walked into a ballroom no one had invited her to. Celine returned to that same ballroom weeks later on an evening the whole court had been asked to attend. She did not enter through the servants' passage this time. She walked through the great doors themselves in a gown that belonged to no title but suited her regardless, and the room went quiet in a way that felt entirely different from the silence that had greeted Neria months before. Kaylor met her at the center of the floor, in front of everyone. I owe you an apology I should have given years ago, he said, loud enough to carry. Not one that blames only the council for what happened, though they built the lie. I should have searched harder. I should have questioned the evidence instead of accepting it, because it was easier than grieving properly. I buried my love for you under duty, and told myself that was strength. It wasn't. Celine studied him for a long moment. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, she said. I need you to understand that. I'm not the same woman who gave you a pendant 7 years ago. I know, he said. I'll remember every day, so I never fail you again. He didn't ask for a crown beside his, or a ceremony, or a marriage arranged for tomorrow. He simply asked quietly for permission to keep the promise he'd made her before the war ever took him from her. Celine took his hand. You came back, she said. Neria wedged herself between them and grabbed a hand from each, beaming up at the entire watching court. We're a family now, she announced, as if this settled every remaining question in the room, which, as far as she was concerned, it did. The applause started slow from the human servants along the walls who understood exactly what they were watching. It spread to the loyal guards next, and finally, unevenly but genuinely, through vampire nobles who had decided, in the wake of everything, that a new era was worth trying. The castle changed in the months that followed, not all at once but steadily. Flowers began appearing in corridors that had once held nothing but weapons and old banners. Human children studied beside young vampires in rooms that had never once been shared before. Celine founded a healing house in the poorest district, the same streets that had once held a crumbling cottage with a leaking roof, and Kaylor visited often without guards clearing the way ahead of him, without ceremony trailing behind. Neria's laughter became something the whole castle simply expected to hear, echoing down halls that had forgotten, for far too long, what that sound was for. One evening, the three of them stood together beneath the moonlit towers, the same violet light that had once watched Celine walk out in exile now falling gently over all of them together. Will you ever forget another promise? Neria asked, tipping her head up at him. Kaylor lifted her into his arms without hesitation. Never again. She reached out and wrapped her small hand around his finger, the exact same way she had the night she first walked into his ballroom and undid 7 years of silence with one sentence. Celine leaned into his side, quiet and steady, and he let himself feel the whole weight of her presence without flinching from it. For 7 years, Kaylor had believed his heart had been buried somewhere beneath the throne, lost along with everything else the crown had cost him. Now he understood it had never been buried at all. It had simply been waiting for a little girl brave enough to come and find it. The end.